We have two awesome scholars that I will introduce you to momentarily. My name is Clara Deacon, and I'll be your moderator for today. So first, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items with all of you. Today's session is part of a webinar series by the University of Calgary and their scholars, and the information that will be presented to all of you today is a summary of their research. You will have an opportunity if you'd like to ask questions. Please feel free to submit the questions during the webinar by using the question and answer box on the left side of your screen. We'll keep an eye on these questions during the webinar and we'll try to get to as many of the questions as we can during the session. Also wanted to mention that you'll see some additional resources listed on the right-hand side of your screen. So please take a look at those. There's some helpful links to information related to the topic. And then, of course, if you're on Twitter, help keep the conversation live using the hashtag #ExploreUCalgary. One other note that we wanted to mention is after the webinar, please give us your feedback through a survey. It's available and located on the lower right-hand side of your screen or through the clipboard icon. And we'll try to keep it open a minute or so after it's done so that you can have time to fill it out. So now I'd like to introduce you to our speakers here with us today. So first we have Beaumie Kim. She's an associate professor in the chair of learning sciences at the Werklund School of Education. She has a PhD and MED from the University of Georgia and a BA from Hanyang University. Her research focuses on empowering learners as designers of their own and others' learning using games. And we have her Twitter handle there as well for you. Next, we have Pratim Sengupta. Pratim is an associate professor of learning sciences and research chair of STEM education at the Werklund School of Education. Pratim designs open source programming languages and computer modeling tools. He also researches how these tools can be part of a cultural transformation in K-12 classrooms and public spaces around innovation and scientific literacy. And his Twitter handle is there for you as well. So both of your expertise seem very interesting, and I know we're all very excited to hear more. So I wanted to just say welcome and thank you for being here with us today. So to start things off, we're going to do a bit of an audience poll just to see who's in our audience today. So if you could just fill that out quickly for us. And while we wait, Beaumie, could you tell us a little bit about what you're going to be covering today in your slides?
Yes, so I'm going to talk a little bit about gameplay and game design as a learning. So I will talk about how engagement in schools looks different from engagement in games. And I will explain what we mean by playful learning. And I show and discuss the game design and learning processes through the examples from my research. And I will wrap up with how we might support playful learning in other contexts beyond my research.
That's awesome. I think it's a very interesting topic that I think all of our listeners are looking forward to hearing more about. So let's take a look at our poll results. So it looks like we have a number of educators here in the audience with us today, but there seems to be quite a few different groups of people here with us too. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Beaumie, and she can walk us through some of her presentation.
Thank you, Clara. So this is the agenda that I just talked about. So I will go right ahead with talking about engagement. So this slide is a little small. I hope all of you can see it. This is talking about engagement of school quiz. From U.S. Gallup survey. So students' engagement drops over time based on the survey. So during elementary school, students responded 76% they feel they're engaged in school, whereas in middle school goes down to 64, and in high school it goes to 44. And in terms of percentage of students who strongly agree by grade, sorry, this one is really small. Do you mind? No, it doesn't. Sorry. So it goes down throughout the grades that they are engaged in something that they're really good at it in the school was really higher in their younger grade, but that it goes down and kind of meets the plateau toward the high school grade. And finally, this is a survey done in Canada. I am missing the references here. It's it's commissioned by Canadian Education Association, and it's by Williams, Frieden, and Milton in 2009. That students' intellectual engagement drops in the similar manner, but it goes up a little bit. But then the sense of belonging is really strong throughout the whole school. So Canadian schools must be doing something well in terms of students feeling like they have a place in their schools. So the big difference between games and school is there's a clear choice that when you decide to play games, you actually make your choice, which game you play and how long you play, whether you play multiple times or not. So that's a huge difference. And another thing with the games, you can continue to play. You have a game over and you probably seriously failed and you have a very low score, but you have a chance to repeat the game and continue to have an improvement. Where the school scores, once you're done with the grade, you have less chance to repeat the grade, which would also seem very bad practice on your hand. So when a lot of scholars in education talk about games, we're not only talking about playing games, but also creating games, because it relates to playful learning. When you think about your play as a young child, it's different from playing games that has a clear goal. Very creative, and a lot of times it's improvised. Some of the rules are emerged, and the way that you score may continue to evolve. You try to put in more challenges over time. Sometimes you give certain benefits to younger players if you're playing with younger people. So a lot of things are very creative and improvised. And it's very emotional because it often happens in the social setting, and you laugh and you invite your friends, and sometimes those laughter becomes invitation. If you see your friends laughing by playing certain games, you pay attention and maybe run to there and try to engage in there. So it's very emotional practice, and it's very social, always social. And scholars talk about magic circle, where you actually create this magic circle that certain rules and norms are understood only within this circle. So people from outside, when we look at young kids play something, we have no idea what's happening and why they're doing certain ways and why they're laughing, because they have formed those rules in very creative ways that make sense amongst them. And it's very cognitive. They're learning throughout the whole place because they're making sense of the rules, also about themselves. And that's a process of understanding ourselves, or as well as expressing ourselves. So that continues with identity negotiation, because the play happens with diverse personalities, different curiosities, different ways of being creative, and those come in as things improvise, as things continue to evolve, as you invent new goals, as you invent new rules. So all these things happen. We believe in playful learning, and we want to promote that in our learning process in multiple levels and different contexts of learning. So game design and learning that I promote in diverse settings is because games are models of systems. If you think about any games, they're very systematic and they're structured with the rules. You have to know the rules, but it's very dynamic when you play it. Once you start playing games, it's different experience every time. It changes depending on different players. So it's a systemic at the same time, very dynamic. And in creating games, actually learners need to understand all of these complex set of meanings. They have to understand the systems. They have to transform some of these systems into the rules that could be playable within the games. And by playing and designing games, you actually construct very different relationship with the knowledge that you're trying to create. That's very different from just playing the games or reading the text. You're becoming a creator of a game that other people can come in and have a totally new experience. And it also encourages, because you have to create stories around the game, storytelling, as well as identity expression that I talked about in relation to playful learning. And you have to be very critical about what you're trying to put in. You have to decide which content, which rule matters within your game. You have to think about systems. You have to continuously solve the problem in order to create a game. So I'm going to talk about games that students created in one of the Calgary's middle schools. And in this setting, I worked with the teachers and some experts create a lesson plan that integrates multiple disciplines. The main ones are Renaissance and Simple Machines. And they also were learning number sense, which was rate and ratio, and some English literature, because they had to present the game, as well as they had to come up with a game manual for others to understand the game. So as I mentioned, they were engaged in problem solving, decision making. They have to evaluate designs as well as content that they need to include within the game. Another thing that came up a lot of times with the experts who came, expert game designers who came to the class, was balancing the game. When you try to create a system has to balance. The player has to have a similar chances, so that multiple iterations of creating game was really important. You have to play test whenever that you have a new ideas and new rules created. And we actually introduced one structure of the game, which was role-playing card game. I don't know if people are familiar with that, but that varies because some students had a lot of experience with role-playing card games, whereas other students were more familiar with board games and other kinds of games. So it ended up mixing a lot of different genres, and they improvise the new rules as they go through the process. And then the game design ranges from trivia to very complex role-playing and strategy games. We try to move away from a lot of trivia, but that was really hard, as they might think that learning and education may engage a lot of question and answer. But we still advocate designing games because there's still decision-making and problem-solving in that process, because they have to decide which questions are important. And what point they want to use that particular question. So it's much better than just reading or listening to lectures. So these are two examples of that particular project. The first one is Race of Renaissance. This was a role-playing card game. They had 4 characters as a player: Da Vinci, Galileo, Gutenberg, and Kepler as their playable characters. So you have to build your deck with these 4 different characters. So they had an action card, they have to have an accomplishment, and they have a masterpiece that would help them to win the game from the 4 important Renaissance figures. There are also neutral actions, reaction card, and chance cards, and they call the points as a brilliance points because they're actually becoming more brilliant and using their brilliance through the process. And then players unlock different actions as they go through, and they achieve the masterpiece. And some of the things they unlock, it would actually benefit the whole, the other characters, because it was beneficial to the mankind, not just for the figure themselves. So they thought about all these impacts of different people. And Renaissance and Rebirth was a board game, and they put it as R:R, and it was analogy to weight-10 ratio that they were actually using within the game rule, and that was one of the content for their number sense. So they were focusing on spread and impact of knowledge during Renaissance period, and they were using some of the hydraulic early ideas of Da Vinci, and they had to navigate through the game by trading, purchasing goods, and building through non-linear paths. If you can see the board, the path is not linear, very different from the Monopoly kind of game that you go through the same route continuously. And because of spread of ideas, there were two universities. In order to build either boat or house, you actually have to stop by these two universities, one of the universities, to get a university card. So they had this set of cards that they need to collect in order to build houses or ships. And they had an island for fishing so that they can survive, and all those things were included within the board to actually reflect a little bit of daily life of Renaissance as well. So you can actually see that they considered what was happening in that world, and then the weight-10 ratio aspect, they use it for trading. So you need certain cards, 3 cards to trade with another card. So they use that concept for designing the rules within the game. Next example is more computer-based. It's called Minecraft. And some of you may not have played, but you might have seen your kids play. It's really popular. Has been popular for a number of years. So this particular one was used in a classroom that's art-based school. So the teacher have them create artifacts. It didn't have to be Minecraft. So Minecraft was one of the choices that students had as a creation project. So this is actually my students' dissertation project. So they had to translate their understanding of Aztec in the social studies curriculum into Minecraft product. So here the example was Mesoamerican bowl game. So they had to understand the cultural practices of Aztec, and they chose to recreate some experiences in Mesoamerican bowl game. And they thought about dark experience. That's why the first screen capture is really dark. They use a dark background and red to symbolize the blood that was involved in the bowl game and the sacrifices of the result. As a result of the sacrifices, so they wanted to use blood color and dark color to use that.
So, Beaumie, what ages were the students who were creating some of these games?
So the both were middle school. The first one was grade 7, and this one is grade 8.
Okay.
So here they had to, because they were creating game within Minecraft, they had to also learn some command blocks. So that gives little entrance point to the coding, but that wasn't the focus, and that was the choice that some students made to go into the command blocks and do some level of coding within Minecraft. And there were differences in terms of abilities of using Minecraft among students. So there were a lot of peer mentorship happening within the class, as well as from the teachers. And this one is a project that I've been working with engineering professor here, Lale Bejad, and some of her students, and Marian Egerman, that students were creating games within the engineering class for circuit design. So here what they need to do was they had to use algorithms to create the games. So the rules have to use algorithms that they're learning within their engineering course. So if you look at the first one, it's called Dungeoneering, where they have to use that black boxes. I believe those were scales, so that you have to use those blue boxes and fill them in that would make them open the door so that you can exit this particular level and move on to the higher level. So it really challenges them to use their algorithm in another setting, have a deeper understanding about the content that they're learning. And this one is a project that I am doing within Werklund School of Education, one with Mio Takeuchi, and the second one is actually Dr. Pratim Sengupta here. The first one is a very simple game that's math related. So you decide which properties that you would like to put on how many at the beginning of the game. And then the way you attack the land is just calculating, summing up the number of these blocks, and if it's higher than the land that you're attacking, you're winning that particular land. So we were thinking about how this kind of a simple game, but also you have to use a lot of different strategies, could be used in the early years classroom. So the photo that next to it is the photo that we took during the class, that they create a block, create the properties for the board within the floor of next to the classroom. So they were actually using their body as part of the game and trying to understand what could happen and how that may impact embodied understanding about the math. And for with the Pratim, we were exploring playful coding through games, so that we gave a game that they can manipulate. So we used the net logo that Pratim has been using with his research for a long time. And there are particular area that they can actually change the properties and explore game design, as well as enter into a little bit of a play, a coding, and they can engage in a lot of different experiments, which Pratim will talk much more deeper about playful coding practices in the presentation.
So one question that we received that's related to this is, so how do you balance individual game creativity with all the information that students obviously must learn about a topic for standardized testing? How do you kind of find a balance between those two things?
So a lot of these things, standardized testing, people, like a lot of teachers as well as parents, also us, are worried about standardized testing. But what we find and encouraging is that students actually learn to think and have a deep understanding about the content, so that it's much easier when you actually go for the study of standardized testing. They don't need to spend too much time on actually trying to recite the information, because they immediately understand what is written on the textbook, and that directly impacts their work. So in the earlier board game class that they actually, after the class, they went through some of the content because students were worried and teachers were worried, and students were like, oh, I already know this. And they were really comfortable with reading the content from their textbook, which we were often concerned about that. I'm not saying that we should disregard that, but I think much less, there's a much deeper understanding happening through this practice than understanding standardized tests.
And do you think that also, in some ways, the game simulation is also leading it to be more memorable with that experiential piece as well?
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's much more memorable because you become a creator of knowledge and experience, and you make sense of those knowledge much, much deeper. And you have much closer relationship with the knowledge. As you create your own game, you emotionally detach to it. When you see other people play that game, you actually understand how that system works even more deeper. Mm-hmm. That's where iteration happens and deepening of their learning happens. So I'm going to wrap up. So in supporting playful learning with games, you don't have to think about, one of the fears of educators is we compare with these complex commercial games that companies spend millions of dollars to produce the game, and we often compare with the games, and educational games can never be that way because we don't have that much money. But simple games are okay, especially if you engage them in some of the redesigning, adopting, and modding those games. But they have to think deeper about those games. And when you start designing and changing the game, it doesn't matter how simple the graphics are. It doesn't matter how even simple the games are. You have a special, it's very special when you create your own. Like I believe a lot of you have experience creating something simple that, experts can create in a few minutes. It took you days, but it's still your child and it's really dear to your heart. So that's why we engage in design practices. So simple games are okay, and you can start with the simple games, and when you engage them in design, that's totally, it will be much deeper than trying to come up with a design with complex games. And there are always intensive game goals, but there will be emergent player goals, which you should allow them to pursue, because that's where they will find pleasure, where they will hear them laugh, and where that's where you will find other groups being invited to look at their work and see each other's work, and that's how they learn much deeper. And my suggestion is distributing some design responsibilities. As an educators, we often try to prepare everything for the learners. Activity has to be designed in a really, you have to be really prepared, you have to know everything. That may not need to happen for some of the game design, because some of, like Minecraft, the teacher that my student worked with didn't know everything about Minecraft, but there were some experts that were really helping other kids. So engage them as peer mentors. Also bring them to use different kinds of means. You don't have to decide, like, all of you have to use this particular design resources, but you can have them to come up with their own design resources. And it's also related, it also could include other things that you need to design. Group norms, classroom norms, or evaluation criteria. If they think that some of the things that they started to design was really important, bring them to the classroom so that whatever that their ideas could be much more important and deeply investigated among the students. With that end, I will pass to Pratim, who will talk much more deeply about playful coding practices.
All right. So what I'm going to talk about really is how to open up the worlds of science, technology, engineering, and mathematics in our public education system, not just K-12 education systems, in a way that brings these disciplines together in the experiences of learning and teaching. STEM is now a very popular acronym, and the way I want to operationalize the word STEM here is through a set of 4 practices. One is modeling, the second is engineering design, the third is designing for use. So building anything that someone else actually can use. And then the fourth is coding. And STEM, I would situate at the intersection of these 4 practices. And the arc of this, I started my career in the academy as a physicist, so that's where I'll come from. But the arc of this really begins with learning to view science as not just facts or truths, but science as a very human act to build models that are very powerful because they can explain things that we experience but don't understand. They can also explain things that we cannot experience, but we can still understand. And so this is the photograph. The diagram that you're looking at is actually James Maxwell, a famous English physicist who made this diagram. This is a make-believe diagram. It doesn't exist in reality, but it can explain how electric field lines work. And this diagram actually revolutionized what we now know today and now experience today as electricity and magnetism. And the other example is Einstein's equation. It's a simple equation that, again, helped us understand who we are in relationship to the big universe that we are in. That one simple equation, right? And then the other is a model of the DNA. Again, something we cannot see with our bare eyes or touch with our bare hands very easily, but there is a model that actually helped us understand maybe what we are made of. So science is as much an act of imagination as it is an act of prediction and control. And what's interesting, especially over the last several decades, is that with the use and ubiquity of computers, science has become inseparable from coding and computation. So this is actually a diagram from a paper that I published as a physicist in 2006 or 2007, and this, what you're looking at is a really interesting mix. The dotted green lines are actually the lines that came out of a real experiment that I did with a big nuclear magnetic resonance spectrometer. The blue lines are the lines that I wanted to see, and the red lines are the lines that theoretically came out of coding. So physics is actually, in this case, it's both experiments, it's reality, it's hypothetical reasoning, it's modeling on the computer, it's coding. So all of that becomes science. And so science itself is more interdisciplinary than we think of it to be. So it's not just an equation, not just a set of facts, but the way we come about to build an explanation. It involves a lot more diversity and complexity in our experience. So to situate, why are we talking about this? To situate this work, I'm going to mention to you two phrases. One is computational thinking, and one is integrated STEM. And these are predominantly the mandates that are guiding our public education system, not just in Canada, but also in the U.S. and even more globally, in all the developing and developed nations. What this actually means is, computational thinking is a way of describing the kind of thinking that we engage in when we actually use coding to build something on the computer or to explain something. Integrated STEM is essentially the act of bringing together the STEM disciplines. And what this argues for is, what this asks us to, what this invites us to do is reimagine what learning can be. So rather than learning being, let's look at the science textbook and open up the chapter on solar systems and let's figure out what the sun does. What it actually helps us do is helps us think about, could we design a classroom where math, engineering, and coding, and maybe a little bit of modeling and science, could they all happen together as part of one experience? That's a lot more complex. And this is not a make-believe hypothetical reality, because in professional practice, this is in the professions, in the engineering professions, teams are interdisciplinary, and what we actually engage in is a very complex experience of learning. So what you're looking at, the images on the screen, are actually examples of two fourth grade students designed machines, simple machines that uses levers and pulleys to control the movement of an obstacle over a sensor that is connected to a computer, and the sensor actually senses distance, and on the computer there is a program that using VMAP, a programming language that we built in our lab, that actually allows you to do simple logo-like programming, but it actually connects it to the world outside through sensors. And so the resulting experience is, you engage in learning to code, you engage in learning to do mathematics. So what the goal here for this activity was to draw a square. But, it's a shape that we all know how to draw, but we tried to do it in the most difficult way in some sense. And actually that turns out to be a pretty exciting thing to do. I mean, then drawing a square is no longer something that we can just do in a flash. It becomes an activity that spreads over several weeks. In this case, it became a project in a classroom that happened every week, 2 days over a span of 4 months. The machines that the students designed ended up being used by actual teachers, by real mathematics teachers in 4th grade and 5th grade. And in order to explain to the teachers how to work with these things, the students actually realized they need to they cannot just assume that people will understand what someone else designed. So they ended up designing user guides. So what you're looking at now are user guides designed by the same students. To your left is the user guides they designed before actually interacting with the real teachers who were not involved in their class, but we brought them in from outside. And what happened was, they looked at the user guide on the left, they tried to work with the machines, they really didn't understand anything about the machine. So then, the students thought that the teachers, of course, who we brought in were the problem. And then their class teacher decided to work with the students' anxieties rather than ignore them. And she would ask them, okay, so how do you make them understand? Let's assume that they have problems, but let's talk about these problems. How do you explain to people with such problems? So what you're looking at to the right is the same kids. They realized they had to explain how every part of the complex machine actually works. What happens when they move an obstacle over a sensor? How is that talking to the code? How is the code then making the square? And then what you end up with is a really, really nuanced and complex form of explanation where there is mathematics involved, there is coding involved, and there is engineering design involved, because they're also thinking about communicating what this means to somebody else who was not there in the room when they designed it. Then we also noticed something else, that as things get really complex, students start inventing gestures that are not just about coding, but gestures that are mathematically meaningful. And so here is a set of screenshots where another 4th grade student is actually explaining how he can change the shape of the square that he's drawing by operating the machine that he has designed. So the other example that we have is, we have been working on this idea for the last 2 years is, how can we take this kind of work outside the classroom to public spaces? And we have 2 examples of this. One actually is housed right at the University of Calgary, the Werklund School of Education. In the main floor, there are 3 big screens, 80-inch screens that we have installed, and they're actually running code that was designed by computer scientists, but now it's open to the public. Anyone can go in, play with the code, and actually change the code, not just play with the simulation, but change the actual code that is running the simulation. And then we have also designed a very similar exhibit at TELUS Park, which actually will be open to the public from next week. And both these exhibits on campus and at Spark, they try to model a complex phenomenon that we experience every day if you look up how birds flock. And turns out this used to be a really difficult problem for computer scientists and scientists to actually understand and model until someone actually came up with the first algorithm in 1981. So what we did was we took that algorithm that was implemented in an open source programming language, and we redesigned it for public spaces where people can actually go in and change the code and interact with the code. What you're looking at here, the image here is one of the first times we actually piloted this experience at Telus Park about a year and a half back, where here's a 9-year-old girl, and she's explaining to us how when we opened up the code to her, she actually the first thing she did was not to change the behaviors, but to change the shape of the birds, and she turned them into minnows because she loves fish and she loves minnows. And the way she did it was she took some of the trapezoids, made them into rectangles, and then she squished the rectangles and got triangles. And all this squishing, is actually it's squishing for her when she's using gestures, but what she's actually experiencing is a form of mathematics. She's collapsing one of the vertices of a rectangle onto another, right? So this is where, really complex geometry and really complex coding can come in through play and desire if you find a place for them. What I'm going to show you now is a video of children actually who have interacted with this exhibit as we piloted at Park. And it's just a really fun video. There's actually some files, and what you can see is how large gender and age of kids, and the background of children that in some age of public space like this and experience this kind of really sophisticated coding, geometry and biology all together happening at once. Again, your brains of them are collapsing. They're all working together, and it's hard to tell if you're coding or if you're doing biology. So what is it that are you having fun? You can see kids dancing, and the dance pad is hooked up to the code. So it's not just dancing. I'll just think that's
Yeah, I'll just sing.
In the interest of time, I'm going to answer the next one. And what we're going to see is another really short video of children actually interacting with the big screens on campus at UFC, at UCalgary, at the Werklund School of Education. You can walk in to the main floor at the Werklund School of Education. You'll see the screens, and you can just please feel free to go and touch them and change things. And on Fridays, we try to be present from 3 to 4 so that if whoever is there, we actually explain how the code works. Again, just a reminder that the coding exhibition at Spark is going to be there for the next while, a few months, maybe a few years. At Telus Park, it's open to everybody. It's on the 2nd floor in the open studio space. Please, feel free to visit. You don't have to be a child to go there. You can be a fully grown adult and you would still have fun in the space. I want to end with, with something I've learned in doing this kind of work, especially in public spaces. I've seen the most powerful experiences of learning to happen when parents and facilitators who are adults actually learn with the children. So, and this is particularly true for us parents, for us teachers. A very powerful form of teaching is just learning with and listening carefully to what the desires of the children are. So, finally, I want to talk about the big 3 takeaways from my work that I've talked about thus far. The first is a counterintuitive point that complex is easy. I think easy is hard in classrooms, and easy is boring because easy is actually hard. To make sense of what Newton taught is actually not trivial. But to recreate a more complex experience is actually easier, and it's more interesting. And especially now that we have lots of interesting ways to code, there is now a ton of research that actually shows that if we could integrate playful coding and building with learning a discipline, then we both learn coding and the discipline in a much more deeper manner and in a much more interesting manner. And this sounds like disruption, but it's not just disrupting. We're not disrupting the curriculum. We are also renewing our intuitions. We are also working with our desires. So in that sense, it's a renewal. So, and it's together that renewal and disruption make this kind of innovation in learning possible. The second big insight that I have had personally is that we should focus on the long game. The tests and the day in, day outs are really important, but we cannot lose sight of what is the long game. And learning does not equal assessment, and because interest actually develops over the long term. And again, as I said, teaching is learning with, and it's that kind of engagement with adults that really help children learn deeply and learn with interest and learn playfully. And finally, I really want to encourage all of us to think with objects. So this is not something that I just say to children, especially now that we live in a world where most of our experiences are online and through social media. I think we have to explicitly find space for both the virtual and the physical. And we have to think with so the minnows on the screen, the voids on the screen, the little triangles on the screen become objects for children to think with, not just to see. And if we don't dilute the complexity of the problems, I think children will find really interesting and new ways to engage with different sides of the problem that we as adults have forgotten, how we would have engaged when we were children. And we have to make room for uncertainty. So all these experiences that I talked about, they were all playing the long game. They were all about playing the long game because we didn't want to give answers right away. Because finding the answer is not the experience. It's getting to the answer. It's playing with possible answers and possible roadblocks. That's where coding can play a big role. That's where play can play a big role. And we just have to move toward a world very consciously where these are the kinds of experiences that we're supporting. So thank you.
And you have a couple resources here for folks as well?
Yes, I forgot to mention. So the website bmapk12.net is where you can download the BMAP programming language. It's specifically designed for STEM classrooms. So it's not just for computer science education. It's actually, there are modules to help kids learn geometry and biology and physics, and m2lab.org is the website for my lab where I have research papers and videos, and my Twitter handle, Pratim, actually is where I mainly communicate with the world sitting from my desk. And if you go there, you'll also find links to a podcast that we at the University of Calgary, especially Beaumie and another colleague of mine, Marika Shanahan, together, and we with our students have started making, where we talk about how STEM education can really be experienced in our everyday lives in a really meaningful way, where we talk about how art can become a part of STEM, how play can become a part of STEM, and what we're doing to make these things more and more a part of your experience.
Great. Well, thank you so much. We do have a couple questions that have come in, so we'll go ahead and ask some of those. So one question that we received was related to when you were talking about complexities and things like that. So do you find that the level of complexity or the level of achievement adds to engagement or enjoyment of the game when you're using it in learning? So how complex it is, or if you're getting levels of achievement, does it make it more fun?
I would say a more complex real problem is actually what makes it more engaging. And I also want to take this opportunity to differentiate complex from complicated. Mm-hmm. So complicated means, something is just difficult. It just takes you, instead of taking the elevators, you have to climb 10 flights of stairs. That's complicated. Complex is something else. Complex is you have to figure out, different parts of a puzzle that have to work together. in order to make the puzzle. So as long as we are creating complex experiences for children, we will find ways to engage them more meaningfully.
Great. One question on a totally different platform was, have you ever used gaming in nursing education? Have either of you experienced anything with that?
I haven't used nursing. I haven't worked with the nursing faculty, but I know that there are people who use simulations and models in medical education. So there are people who are interested in that area. I think it's a very different from the school education, and there are different simulations that they use that actually requires physical simulation, not the simulation within computers. So I'm not sure exactly how to answer that question, but like if someone would like to talk about some ideas about nursing education and how we can engage students in games or game design, we're happy to talk to them.
Great. Do you have anything to add on that?
There are papers that have been published recently that do look at gaming and simulations in nursing education. Simulations are used big time in nursing and medical education, and it's a big part of even professional medical education. What we will see more and more is that researchers from education and medicine will collaborate more. Researchers from medicine and engineering and education will collaborate more, and that's because the interdisciplinarity of STEM that we have talked about is not just something we are arguing for in education. What we are seeing is that the university itself is becoming a more and more interdisciplinary space. We have faculty in education who do philosophy, and we have faculty in education who build programming languages. We have computer science professors who study how humans think about code. So the world's really, revealing itself in its complexity to the academy also.
And I want to give you an example of a game called Folded. It's Fold, FOLD.IT. That they were doing the research, scientists were doing research on DNA folding, and they thought that gamers are better in recognizing patterns. So they created games in collaboration with the game designers, and they sent out the puzzles within the game. So gamers actually solved those problems that scientists could not. By recognizing that patterns, and they have an article published in Nature that they listed all the gamers who play that game. So those kind of recognizing different expertise, that's actually really important, and learning from each other is the most important part of profession that we have in academy.
So one question that I have is that, so since we have a lot of educators in the audience, what are some things that you guys would recommend as next steps for educators looking to implement these new ways of learning in their classroom?
But propose a challenge that all educators can try to do maybe tomorrow. Please build a game with your students. Build a brand new game that no one has built before. And let's start with what your children want to do, what the students want to do. And, that's the big thing that I think we have learned. I don't want to speak for you, Beaumie, but I have read your work, and you've also argued for the same thing, that if we start where children want to go, if we start there, then the pedagogy and the classroom becomes a fundamentally more complex space than what we imagine as adults on our own.
Mm-hmm. And the game doesn't have to be complex at all. Like very simple games that they design, it becomes complex.
Yeah.
It becomes complex because they have different personalities, and once they start playing that game, they realize rules are not fitting well, and then there's a really deep conversation could happen with just one rule. And changing little bit, tweaking that rule could be a very big conversation, which is much more complex than trying to solve a problem from your worksheet. And then I saw one question. I take through the question while Pratim was talking, and someone was asking about how do you know that they're learning, that you want them to learn. But I would ask same questions for any assessment practice. Like if you have a multiple choice question, 50 different questions, how do you know that they actually understand input about the content by, getting 100% from that paper? You would not know that they have a deep understanding. They may not be able to use any of the knowledge that they were able to perform in the test in any context that you want them to be performing. So I think you have to really think about also challenges of assessment that we're using.
There's one particular question I want to address, which is about addiction, game addiction, and the elementary level. And this is actually a real concern. Real concern certainly in terms of experiences of many parents and many teachers and many students and many adults. There is no elixir, there is no panacea for addiction. That's just a one-step solution. We are constantly living in danger of being addicted. We are in fields of, we're surrounded by devices and the lure of experiences that can draw us in. What I would recommend is that the more we help our children realize that they are not just consumers of these technologies and devices, but they can build these technologies and devices. That might help mitigate this problem to a large extent. So buying a game off the shelf can be pedagogically very useful and helpful, but that should not be the only kind of experience that children should have. Just learning to code on a programming language that someone else has built, by making your cat move, is not the most meaningful way to learn coding. We have to think more deeply about the essence of technology, and the essence of technology is never technology itself. The essence is the experience that it can enhance. And we have to get our children and our students to a place where they, from very early on, because we are surrounded by consumable media, from very early on, we need to inculcate the sense that, no, this is not just something we can use, this is also something we can build ourselves.
Totally. So unfortunately, we're running out of time, so we're going to have to wrap up. But we just want to say thank you to Beaumie and Pratim for sharing your insights with us today. And thank you also to all of you who tuned in. We hope you enjoyed it. Once again, don't forget to fill out the survey just located on the bottom of your screen. And if you enjoyed today's presentation, please sign up for our other webinars, download ebooks, and learn more at ucalgary.ca/explore/collections. And finally, also, if you have any ideas for any other UCalgary webinar topics, please email us at exploreUCalgary@ucalgary.ca. So thank you to everyone, and we're going to have to sign off for now, but we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.